Hi, my name is Shon Harris, and I'm going to be your instructor for the 10 full domains that's covered on the CISSP exam. I've been in this industry for many years before anybody actually really cared about it. When I started in security, I said that I was very interested in it because it was complex. You have to really understand technology before you could secure it. And 10 years ago, I was told, well, that's nice that you are interested in security, but you'll never have a full-time job in it. Well, not only do I have a full-time job, a lot of people have a full-time job in security because of the importance of it. I've written a few books on security, CISSP All-in-One, The Passport, Gray Hat Hacking. I'm halfway through the CISA book right now. And I write articles for Information Security Magazine and Windows 2000. I'm on Search Security, so I have a lot of information throughout the industry if you're interested in getting more. So I'm going to be working with you and being your instructor through all of the 10 domains. Now, I've taught this for about 4 years. My CISSP book is a best-selling book for this subject, and it's going in its 4th edition. So I think you're going to be in good hands, and we'll get through it together. We're going to go over the common body of knowledge, which makes up the CISSP exam. And this is 10 full domains that we have listed. It's access control, information security, physical security, business continuity management. And this is really foundational information for you as a practitioner, either at a company, as a security consultant, as a business person who is responsible for any type of security within your environment. So it's a good coverage of all that touches security, because most people think security is just one thing, like a firewall, an IDS. They think it's very technical. But this exam is good because it covers all the components of security. And if you really get to know this information and not just study it to pass the exam, if you really know this information, it'll be useful to you out in the industry. Now, the exam itself has 250 questions. And you know, they're not even high-tech yet. They've got, just like when you took the SAT test, you have to fill in those little bubbles. Now, 25 of the questions of the exam are not even going to be graded. They're new questions that they're kind of testing out to see if they're good questions or not. But you're not going to know which are going to be graded or which are not going to be graded. So overall, you have 250 questions that you need to answer in a 6-hour period. They give you a 6-hour period. Most people are done about 4.5 hours. There's nothing that you could take in for the exam except if English is not your first language, you could take in a dictionary that goes from one language to English. And they're actually getting more strict about being able to take in cell phones or those types of things, so nobody's going to cheat. Now, a lot of people have heard about the CISSP exam, and after you take the CISSP exam, you'll be frustrated. There's not a person who's come out of this exam and has not been frustrated. And that's because there's 2 reasons that this exam is difficult. One is because it covers so much information. A lot of people may have a specialty in network security, or maybe they have a specialty in business continuity. But hardly anybody really knows all 10 domains: application security, operation security. So that's one reason that the exam is difficult, because of all the information it covers. Now, to be truthful, the other reason that it's difficult is the way the questions are written. They're not straightforward, they're a little tricky, and we're going to go through some questions to give you an example of what you can run into. But this is a very difficult exam. The questions are cognitive, which means that you can't just memorize a term and be able to answer a question. You actually not only have to understand the term and the concept, you have to apply it to something in the real world. So this is more of a cognitive test, which is why you need to know the information to a certain depth instead of just skating over it and trying to study a month before you take it. Now, we will be going over all of these domains to quite a degree that most people don't get into. There's a lot of courses out there and a lot of products that don't get to the necessary level that you need not only to pass the exam, but even understand the elements so you can use it out in the real world. So we will be going through these, and I'll be teaching you, giving analogies, giving you real world scenarios, because that's important. Now, on exam day, you do have to have a ID, a picture ID, and they're going to require you to have a registration number to go in for the exam. And you want to make sure that you have signed up for the exam and you've got your registration number back, because every course I've ever taught, somebody didn't get their registration number because ISC Squared sent it to the wrong address, or they sent it to the work address instead of home. So don't run into that issue. You have to have that registration ID before you could take this exam. Now, if you don't have enough experience, because to take the CISSP exam, you have to have 4 years of experience, or you can have a bachelor's degree. You can read through on their website, the requirements to actually sit for this exam. But if you don't have that much experience in information security, they have something that's called the associates, which means you could sit for the exam and then you can get the experience, and somebody has to sign off that you've actually got the experience. So people who are coming out of college that don't have the experience in the industry are taking and getting an associate's degree. So don't think that you don't have enough experience to be able to do this. There's a couple ways that you can approach it. Now, it's important if you're when studying for CISSP, this is it. This should take over your world for quite some time because of the amount of information, the complexity of some of the information. This should be your core topic and your core focus in life if you really want to pass this exam, because I know a lot of security professionals, very bright, very talented, very experienced, who have not passed it. So you need to take it seriously. Hi, my name is Shon Harris, and I'm going to be your instructor for the 10 full domains that's covered on the CISSP exam. I've been in this industry for many years before anybody actually really cared about it. When I started in security, I said that I was very interested in it because it was complex. You have to really understand technology before you could secure it. And 10 years ago, I was told, well, that's nice that you are interested in security, but you'll never have a full-time job in it. Well, not only do I have a full-time job, a lot of people have a full-time job in security because of the importance of it. I've written a few books on security, CISSP All-in-One, The Passport, Gray Hat Hacking. I'm halfway through the CISA book right now. And I write articles for Information Security Magazine and Windows 2000. I'm on search security. So I have a lot of information throughout the industry if you're interested in getting more. So I'm going to be working with you and being your instructor through all of the 10 domains. Now, I've taught this for about 4 years. My CISSP book is a best-selling book for this subject, and it's going in its 4th edition. So I think you're going to be in good hands, and we'll get through it together. We're going to go over the common body of knowledge, which makes up the CISSP exam. And this is 10 full domains that we have listed. It's access control, information security, physical security, business continuity management. And this is really foundational information for you as a practitioner, either at a company, as a security consultant, as a business person who is responsible for any type of security within your environment. So it's a good coverage of all that touches security, because most people think security is just one thing, like a firewall, an IDS. They think it's very technical. But this exam is good because it covers all the components of security. And if you really get to know this information and not just study it to pass the exam, if you really know this information, it'll be useful to you out in the industry. Now, the exam itself has 250 questions. And They're not even high tech yet. They've got, just like when you took the SAT test, you have to fill in those little bubbles. Now, 25 of the questions of the exam are not even going to be graded. They're new questions that they're kind of testing out to see if they're good questions or not. But you're not going to know which are going to be graded or which are not going to be graded. So overall, you have 250 questions that you need to answer in a 6-hour period. They give you a 6-hour period. Most people are done about 4.5 hours. There's nothing that you could take in for the exam except if English is not your first language, you could take in a dictionary that goes from one language to English. And they're actually getting more strict about being able to take in cell phones or those types of things, so nobody's going to cheat. Now, a lot of people have heard about the CISSP exam, and after you take the CISSP exam, you'll be frustrated. There's not a person who's come out of this exam and has not been frustrated. And that's because there's 2 reasons that this exam is difficult. One is because it covers so much information. A lot of people may have a specialty in network security, or maybe they have a specialty in business continuity, but hardly anybody really knows all 10 domains: application security, operation security. So that's one reason that the exam is difficult, because of all the information it covers. Now, to be truthful, the other reason that it's difficult is the way the questions are written. They're not straightforward, they're a little tricky, and we're going to go through some questions to give you an example of what you can run into. But this is a very difficult exam. The questions are cognitive, which means that you can't just memorize a term and be able to answer a question. You actually not only have to understand the term and the concept, you have to apply it to something in the real world. So this is more of a cognitive test, which is why you need to know the information to a certain depth instead of just skating over it and trying to study a month before you take it. Now, we will be going over all of these domains to quite a degree that most people don't get into. There's a lot of courses out there and a lot of products that don't get to the necessary level that you need, not only to pass the exam, but even understand the elements so you can use it out in the real world. So we will be going through these, and I'll be teaching you, giving analogies, giving you real world scenarios, because that's important. Now, on exam day, you do have to have a picture ID, and they're going to require you to have a registration number to go in for the exam. And you want to make sure that you have signed up for the exam and you've got your registration number back. Because every course I've ever taught, somebody didn't get their registration number because ISC Squared sent it to the wrong address, or they sent it to the work address instead of home. So don't run into that issue. You have to have that registration ID before you could take this exam. Now, if you don't have enough experience, because to take the CISSP exam, you have to have 4 years of experience, or you can have a bachelor's degree. You can read through on their website, the requirements to actually sit for this exam. But if you don't have that much experience in information security, they have something that's called the associates, which means you could sit for the exam and then you can get the experience, and somebody has to sign off that you've actually got the experience. So people who are coming out of college that don't have the experience in the industry are taking and getting an associate's degree. So don't think that you don't have enough experience to be able to do this. There's a couple ways that you can approach it. Now, it's important when studying for CISSP, this is it. This should take over your world for quite some time because of the amount of information, the complexity of some of the information. This should be your core topic and your core focus in life if you really want to pass this exam, because I know a lot of security professionals, very bright, very talented, very experienced, who have not passed it. So you need to take it seriously. Now, in this domain, it's information security and risk management. They used to call it security practices or security management practices. And we're going to go over kind of what they call the soft skills: development of policies, development of a risk management program, development of standards, and we're going to get into what security governance actually means and how to do a structure with that. We'll talk about the type of training and the type of awareness that needs to be in place. So in this domain, it's more of what a lot of people call the soft skills, instead, because it's not overly technical. But this is where a lot of companies actually are moving into. A lot of companies have their head down in technology, and because of all the regulations, and now because security is a business issue, these things are much more important or get a lot more attention than they did in the past. So there's actually a gap in the industry of people who really know how to do these things compared to configuring a firewall or configuring a KDC or something like that. So this is important. You may think it's intuitive and you understand it, but when you actually have to put it in practice, a lot of people have a hard time because it's a new thing. Now, our mainframes, of course, got smaller, more efficient. They could do more different types of batch jobs. But at that time, it was really interesting because that was a glass house. We called it a glass house where the mainframe was. There's only a handful of guys who actually understood how the mainframe worked, interacted with it, and actually when anything went wrong, they didn't just do a configuration like we do today. They went into the code and modified it there. Now the mainframe, at that place, we all took our batch files to the mainframe for whatever job we had to have taken place. And then we figured out that a processing needed to come closer to the actual users. So we moved a lot of the processing power from the mainframes down to the user desktops. Now, why do you think information security is so important today compared to 5, 7, 10 years ago? Well, 7 to 10 years ago, we worked in this mainframe environment. Only a handful of people could interact with the system itself. So at that time, who knew what TCP/IP was? Who knew what the OSI model was? What an API was? At that time, the knowledge about technology was very small, so there wasn't as many people who could do damage. Now, as our culture has grown, we personally actually depend upon more technology than we realize. Healthcare, the energy that we use, and businesses can't run without technology. We actually take technology for granted. It's always there and it provides us a lot of functionality. Now, anything that you really depend upon is a weakness. And so that's where the attackers have come in. The hackers came in and they knew that that was a weakness. Now, in the beginning, hacking was just a lot of fun. There was just some teenage guys who had too much time in their hands, and it was very challenging to learn about the different protocols and to be able to carry out, bring down different websites or affect something. But now that's actually changed. Hacking has changed from some kids who are interested in it to a much more organized crime, and that's what we're going to get into: identity theft and the types of crimes that are taking place. But the reason that security is so important is because we're so dependent upon it. It protects our money, it protects our data, and as the technology came from the mainframe down to the employees' desktops, now they can interact with it, which means that they can make mistakes. So there's a lot of reasons that security is important. It's going to be around for a long time. And now it's not just general security information you need to know. People actually have to specialize, just like doctors have to specialize, maybe into web services, application security. So this is not going to go away. It's only going to increase because the complexity of our environment is going to increase. So if you look at our environments today, talk about complex. We have networks, we have routers, we have firewalls, but then we're growing outside these bounds. We have wireless, we have road warriors that have to communicate with the corporate environment and the assets. We're setting up things like web services, which allow different companies to use each other's services in open standards. We have cell phones that are basically computers. And the software itself is increasing in the complexity because we want more and more functionality. So our environment is going to only get more complex in the devices that we put on it and the software. Now, why does that have anything to do with security? Well, security and complexity do not get along. The more complex something is, the harder it is to secure it. Like in Windows 2000, there's 40 million lines of code, and that was Windows 2000. How do you secure that much code? So in our environments, not only do we have devices like routers and switches, we have software that works on them, we have operating systems, we have applications, we have users, and now we don't even have a closed environment. We're interacting with other companies, with the internet, with partners. So our environment is becoming much more porous, and the complexity of it is going to increase. And so if you're in security, you're always going to have a job. Now we're going to go through some security definitions. And this is a part that a lot of people think is simplistic and kind of boring, but what's a class without definitions? But on the exam, not only are you going to need to know the definition of a term, you're going to have examples, you're going to have to know examples of them, and be able to think about them in a cognitive way, in a real world way. So we'll first look at a vulnerability. A vulnerability is a lack of a countermeasure or some type of a weakness. Then there's a threat. Now the threat is that something or somebody is going to find out about that vulnerability and exploit it. That's what the threat is. Now risk. A lot of people don't have down the definition of risk. Risk is the business impact and the probability of that vulnerability being exploited. And then there's the countermeasure. That's what you're going to put in place to protect get rid of the vulnerability. And then there's exposure. Exposure means you have a vulnerability. It's there. You're exposed to, maybe you don't have antivirus in place. You're exposed to an infection. Now, there's actually a lot of types of vulnerabilities, and you need to think outside of the box, or you need to broaden your horizon on the types of vulnerabilities that are within your environment. When we talk about vulnerabilities, unfortunately, a lot of people think about open ports on a firewall. Well, that is a vulnerability. But what about your people who aren't trained on how to properly configure things? Or your people maybe answering the phones aren't properly trained about social engineering? Or you're not watching your physical security. These are all vulnerabilities, and this is what's difficult about information security, is thinking about all the bad things that could take place. Now here are some examples of vulnerabilities that a lot of people don't think about. The first one I put up is it's a lack of understanding. Our environment, our industry as a whole, we are continually learning more. We're maturing. This is a very immature industry, and because of our immaturity, because of our lack of knowledge, this is why a lot of attacks and a lot of bad things could take place. So that's one thing, education, understanding what the bad guys are going to do and how to make sure they're not going to do it to you. There's another one that's called authorization creep, which is all over the place. Authorization creep means that somebody has too much access. Let's say I started a company, I'm a clerk. And I'm given rights and permissions and such, and then I get promoted and now I'm a manager. Then I get other rights and permissions added on instead of subtracted. And this happens on and on as somebody moves from one department to another. They have too much access. In almost every organization today, users have too much access. Why do we care? Well, the reason is because now this allows that user to carry out mistakes. It also allows, if somebody actually gets a hold of that account, now they can access a lot of resources. So in the next domain, we're actually going to talk about identity management and how the industry is trying to get a hold of this authorization creep issue. Ways of detecting fraud. A lot of companies actually have attacks that have gone on for years, successful attacks. Social security numbers have been taken, personal information have been taken for years, and they don't have the right things in place to actually detect that those things are going on. So there's a lot of different types of vulnerabilities. It's not just technical, it's at those different layers, operational, tactical, and strategic. Now, I said that most people don't understand the term risk. And that's because we use them interchangeably. We use vulnerability, threat, and risk interchangeably. Hey, we have this type of risk. Hey, we have this type of vulnerability. Now, it may not seem important to you about having distinct definitions and knowing what they are, but it is important because they are totally different things. For example, one time I was asked to be on a risk management panel. We were a bunch of experts on a panel, and we're going to talk about risk management to about 500 people. We were going to talk about specific tools, and I was given a list of tools that we were to discuss and say what part was great and what part wasn't so great. And what happened is I wrote back to who was putting this conference together. I wrote back and said, I don't think you want me on your panel, because the tools that they actually listed were vulnerability management tools. They were not risk management tools. And in the industry today, a lot of products say they're risk management, and they're not. The easiest thing to do is define a vulnerability. That's a weakness or a hole. The hardest thing to do is actually calculate the business impact of that vulnerability and the probability that that vulnerability is going to get exploited. So the understanding of risk, I think, is very critical. And I'm a consultant. I work in a lot of different environments, and I see the confusion that when people don't have the right definitions down, they're speaking apples and oranges. So in our industry today, risk management is getting more and more and more important because of regulations, because the business people actually get what security means. But again, risk is the probability that a vulnerability is going to be exploited, and then the business impact. How bad is that going to hurt us? Now, how do these all work together? Some people think they're interchangeable, but they're not. Any environment, any organization has a whole bunch of vulnerabilities. Can you plug them all? Can you fix them all? Well, only if you have all the time in the world and an infinite amount of money. You can't address all the vulnerabilities, and you actually don't need to. So you have a whole list of vulnerabilities, and what you have to do is you have to associate a threat to that vulnerability. Because you can have a vulnerability, if there's nothing that can actually take advantage of it, it doesn't matter. So let's say you have an open port that faces the internet. That port may not have a service that could be exploited, and anybody could do anything about it. So you're not going to pay any money or do any configuration for that. So a threat is that somebody's going to find a vulnerability and exploit it. So again, the first step is find all your vulnerabilities. You have to associate them to a threat. Is there something that could take advantage of them? And then you have to calculate the business impact and the probability, if that comes true. What that is, you're calculating the risk. So you find vulnerabilities, and we've had tools out there for years that finds vulnerabilities, associate them to a threat, and then calculating the risk is really where the skill comes in, how it relates to the business. So usually you have a whole bunch of risks listed, and you can't address them all, but you're going to say, these are the top risks, we're going to address those in the first 3 months, these the next 12 months. So it's really important to understand how all of these work together. And I just see, it's not only important for the exam. I'm in the industry, I see the confusion between these things where people don't think definitions are important, but it's actually not the definition, it's the concept and what is the right tool for the right issue. Now, we've talked about the definition of vulnerability, threat, and risk, but where does risk lie? Who's actually responsible for it? That's very important. Who's responsible for it? Who's responsible to ensure that risk is properly mitigated? Now, in the past, security was all in IT. IT understood that the company needed to be protected, but they knew technical security. And they knew that the company needed to spend more money to protect itself. But the business people and senior management didn't get it. They didn't want to hear about it. Now, as regulations have come down, we've got GLB and SOX and HIPAA. Now that's come from the top. So security isn't coming from the bottom anymore. It's coming from the top also. So who is responsible for risk? Well, that's senior management, board of directors. On the CISSP exam, it'll actually specifically say senior management. But in the industry, it's not just senior management. On publicly owned companies, it's also the board, because they're responsible to ensure that the shareholders are properly protected, the company is running smoothly, and that all of these risks are identified and dealt with properly. Now, another interesting thing is that risk should actually be delegated. The risk should not just be within the security realm or just on the CIO's desk or just on the CISO's desk. Risk needs to be delegated to like the business management owners or whoever the department heads are. They need to be held responsible for identifying risk in their department and know how to approach it. It doesn't mean that they have to be security experts. It means that they have to be held responsible for making sure that any types of risks are actually being identified. So although senior management is ultimately responsible, it's important that we get it out throughout the company that each business unit manager or the department head or somebody is responsible, because that department head actually understands that department, understands the type of risks that can take place. And remember, it's not just technical. So ultimately, yeah, senior management, but they can't do it all. They don't understand all the risks that can happen throughout the company. So they need to delegate it, and they need to keep people's feet to the fire. Most companies are not holding any type of business unit manager or department head actually liable or responsible for any type of risk. So it's mainly lip service. So since a lot of companies don't understand risk, they just ignore it. They don't deal with it. They're being forced to. Just like with any security, nobody really wants to do security. Company doesn't really want to understand or pay money for security. They need to profit. They need to make money. But this is life. Security within the corporate world and within the government sectors are only becoming more important, and risk management is really becoming something that is the most important. And this is also something that the auditors are looking at. What type of risk program do you have in place? How are you identifying, mitigating those risks? Now, some other definitions we definitely need to know about are availability, integrity, confidentiality. It's called the AIC triad. It used to be called the CIA triad, but for some reason I guess they thought you'd get confused with the real CIA. So we're going to look at examples of availability, integrity, and confidentiality. But the main concept here is that every single type of countermeasure that we put in place is going to provide one of these services. It's going to provide some type of integrity. It's going to provide some type of confidentiality. So not only do you need to know the definitions and some examples, but you need to know how they match up. This type of countermeasure provides this type of service. Now, in availability, a lot of people don't put availability within security. Most people just think about confidentiality, secrecy. But availability is very important, because if a resource isn't available, you can't do your work. So there's attacks that are taking place against resources, so they're not available. Those are DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks. There's also availability issues that take place that are not attacks, but things get overwhelmed or they go down. So mainly in operations, that domain, we're going to look at the different types of technologies that provide availability, which is redundancy, fault tolerance, those types of things. Now, integrity also falls under this triad. And integrity, a lot of people think it's just the integrity about data. And that's true. The data needs to have its integrity when it's being held on a server, when it's going from one place to the other. We need to make sure that it's not been modified by somebody, or even when it's been corrupted. But in reality, it's not just the data that we need to worry about the integrity. What about the integrity of the environment? What about the actual systems themselves, the integrity of them systems? Do you want people to just install patches as they see fit without actually testing them? If that happens, the integrity of the environment is horrible. You don't have your configuration management in place. So it's not just about data. You need to think about the system, the application, the software, the environment, that things aren't changing in an uncontrollable manner so that integrity is compromised. Now, confidentiality is pretty simple, at least conceptually. This is what people usually think about when they think about security. So we want to make sure that whatever somebody's not supposed to have access to, they don't have access to. And we're going to go through in each one of these domains, we're going to have some type of control that is going to provide confidentiality, access control, encryption, a lot of different things. Because usually the goal is to protect your data. Data today is the gold of the organization. That's usually what needs to be protected the most. So not only do you have to know the definition of confidentiality, but examples of what provides confidentiality. Now, one thing that a lot of people may know about is shoulder surfing. Shoulder surfing is when somebody's looking over your shoulder and they see some type of sensitive information they're not supposed to. That's why when you type in your password, you have those X's that come up, so nobody can look over your shoulder and see those passwords. So that's shoulder surfing, where somebody's looking over and seeing something they're not supposed to. But that's not the whole thing. You've got to think outside, bigger within the environment. What about the people who work with the backup tapes? Do they have the actual access level to be able to access that data on the backups? Maybe not. Maybe there's sensitive data that they shouldn't have access to. When I was in the information warfare unit, everybody had to have a top secret clearance, even the janitors, because the janitors have keys to everything. And they can, they're usually around when nobody else is around, so they had access to top secret information. And what about the people who are doing surveillance? Let's say in a room you have a camera that's surveilling the environment. Well, if you are in an environment that has top secret or even secret information that's being worked on a computer, then that camera can capture what's on those screens. Whoever's doing the surveilling and whoever's maintaining those tapes, do they have the actual clearance? Should they be accessing this type of information? So shoulder surfing, that's simple, where it's looking over your shoulder. But you need to think about, if you actually have sensitive information, who else could be looking at it? Another thing is the area. Do you have it just sitting out? It's not just digital information that we have to protect. It could be in even paper format. Now, social engineering is very interesting. It's not an attack, a technical attack. It's attack against people. Social engineering is skillful lying to get whatever it is you're after. So there's a lot of different ways to do social engineering. You're basically trying to convince somebody else that you have authorization to a system or some type of data that you don't have the authorization for. So somebody can come in and be dressed as a repairman and get past the front desk and get to where they want to go. A lot of social engineering happens over the phone, where somebody calls and says, hey, I'm the administrator. We're having a hard time right now with the systems. We're going to reboot them. I need you to change your password to password. So somebody says, this is the administrator. I'll do what I'm told. They change their password to password. Now the bad guy has their credential set. And social engineering is one thing that the corporate environment doesn't think about as much. The military and the government think about it more, and they do a lot of assessments that include social engineering attacks. In the corporate world, it's usually just about the technical issues and the policies and such. But people are the weakest link. They're the ones who are going to give out sensitive information. It's actually easier to do social engineering and get information from people than ever trying to go through a firewall or hack a system. It's always easier to go through people. And the assessments that are done, like in the government, you pick out people who would have some information, like the commander's secretary or a pilot or somebody that you pick them out and you meet them not at the job, but maybe you meet them at a bar or you meet them somewhere else playing racquetball or something, and you see what little tidbits you can actually get out of them. Because if an attacker is serious about attacking a specific target, what they're going to do is gather as much information about that target before they attack. And that's called footprinting. There's an amazing amount of information in the public sector that can be learned about a corporate environment. You go through the ARIN database for all the IPs that a company has. You go through a WHOIS database for all the domains that a company owns. You look at, let's say somebody has a job opening. In their job description that they need somebody to fill, they'll list the actual type of technology that they have, the type of firewalls, the type of intrusion detection. They'll say, we need people with this type of experience. Now you've just told people what you're actually using in security. And another big way that attackers are getting information is in chat rooms. We have chat rooms and forums for everything. And we have forums where people will help each other out. So let's say I have Sidewinder firewall, and there's a question I have about configuration. So I'll go to a forum and I'll say, hey, we have this type of firewall. I don't know what to do. Can anybody help me? Now there can be an attacker in there specifically to find out who doesn't know what they're doing. And if they could figure out what company it is, which is easy to do, they'll know that that firewall is not configured properly. So social engineering, there's a lot of different ways for data to be leaked out, and this is one thing that is not looked at within the corporate world. You need to test your people to know what they're supposed to say and what they're not supposed to say, and you need to educate them on this. Now, people who are in security get a little cocky, or they think the whole world is just about security. I fall into it sometimes myself. I see other people, my peers, that fall into it. But you need to remember that business people, and they just have their own jobs. Security isn't their life. And so you have to understand that somebody else, like a business person already has a 60-hour-a-week job. They don't even know about security. They don't even want to know. So sometimes security people get a little full of themselves, and they know so much about what somebody should and shouldn't be doing. But we have to be sensitive. We have to properly educate, which that doesn't happen through acting superior or acting like so knowledgeable. We have to be able to be humble and put security information in different languages that people understand. There's mid-management, and then there's senior management, and they'll speak different languages. So we need to know their language so we can make a business case so everybody can understand the security issues within the organization. Now we're going to look at something called security through obscurity. And what this means is that you're actually depending upon that somebody's not smart enough to figure out some type of flaw in your software or in your environment. And in some instances, security through obscurity is okay, but you shouldn't just depend upon it, especially for your whole enterprise. There are people who are dedicated to figure out the flaws and take advantage of them. Some people say, well, I'm not big and nobody's going to come after me. And that's not true. Everybody's a target. So don't think that because your code is proprietary, or that you moved your HTTP to port 8080 or something like that, nobody's going to figure that out, because a lot of these people are quite intelligent and quite motivated. Now, security, there's an interesting thing that's been going on for years. It's called disclosure of flaws within our software. And in my Gray Hat book, I actually wrote a whole chapter on disclosing vulnerabilities within software. There's processes that people should actually go through. But for a long time, companies figured, let's not tell anybody about the flaws within our software because nobody will figure them out. And maybe that was true at one time, but we've got a lot of people dedicated to actually figure out what those flaws are. There's companies like iDefense that will pay for vulnerabilities if you find a vulnerability within software. So there's never, there's always been this conflict or not a great relationship between vendors and Gray Hat, which are people who find vulnerabilities and try to work with the vendor to come out with a fix. There's always been some type of issue between them, and that's why they actually have these ways of, when you identify a software flaw, what to actually do to go through them. But software companies, a lot of times they figure nobody's going to find a flaw, or they will say, yes, there are flaws in our product, but we'll just wait and throw out a patch when necessary. And then the people have to wait until that patch actually comes out. So in that case, companies actually know that there's flaws within their software, but they're not going to fix it. They want to get it out on the market. They need to start making money on it. So they say when somebody actually figures it out, then we'll come up with a patch or an update. And one other thing about flaws, software flaws, there are dedicated people to find these flaws, these vulnerabilities, and you can even purchase zero-day exploits. A zero-day means that there's no fix. There's no patch, there's no hotfix, there's no fix to it. So people will find out these vulnerabilities and they will sell them on the internet, so you could buy them and attack whoever you want to. So we're working with companies, software companies, to try to get their software much more secure. But I don't think it's really going to happen until they're held legally liable or they're going to actually lose market share. Now, one thing that about security through obscurity, it's kind of an ongoing debate. For example, a lot of the algorithms that we know about, DES, AES, those types of algorithms, those are open. That means that anybody can actually look at the code and they can understand the logic. And they're open because the idea is the more eyes that are looking at the code, the more the flaws that could be identified, and that algorithm can be protected. That's one base, that's one group of people. Now there's another group of people that says, nobody's going to look at the code of my algorithm, and that's going to provide an extra layer of security. And that's what the government does. The government has algorithms we don't even know the names of. And we can't look at the code in those algorithms. And people who are in the industry, cryptographers who are not in the military, are suspicious of any type of algorithm that they can't see and they can't look at the logic. So there's two different camps, not only about algorithms, but also about compiled code. We have is open source or compiled code more secure? Well, the open source people feel that the more eyes on the code, the more people that can find some type of flaw, we can work as a team, improve the software so it improves the security for all. The other group says, my software is compiled, which means it's put it into a binary exe, and people aren't going to be able to find the flaws. That's certainly not true, because we've got reverse engineering and fuzzing and a lot of different things, and dedicated people to take that binary exe and find those flaws. But it's a continual debate. But for our purposes, The thing is when you develop an enterprise security program, don't depend upon security through obscurity. You need to use open standards. You need to use things that have been proven, because people are very motivated today. And I mentioned before that at one time hackers were just some young people. They brought down some websites so they could brag to each other. It was all about getting in the limelight. Now, hacking has changed. What's going on today is usually run by organized crime. They are pinpointing, specific targets of who they're going to get, and it's usually, money-oriented. They're profiting from it now. It could be through identity theft. They're attacking actual banks, and there's extortion that goes on, where somebody finds a security vulnerability within a corporate environment, within like their perimeter wall, and they will contact the company and say, look, we know about this, and we will use this exploit against you unless you give us some money. That's extortion. So we have moved, in the hacking world, we have moved from a group of people who really didn't necessarily want to do any damage, but it was all about the limelight. Look at what I've done. Now we're into hackers that don't want to be in the limelight, they don't want to be known about, and that's one reason that the viruses that we get have gone down. Viruses used to go and spread themselves all over the place, but it didn't do any damage, and it didn't do anything for the hacker necessarily, or whoever the virus writer is. Now viruses are really more of the Trojan horses or bots or something that's used to zero in on a target, and they don't want to be known about. It's all about, much more about profit. So we have an interesting history where we had kids who were kind of playing around, to now we have very organized groups of people, all in different countries. China has a lot going on there, but they're organized, they're paid specifically to hack, and they're constantly flying under the radar. So don't think that you're small and nobody knows about you, or you're using something proprietary and nobody's going to be able to get through it. They're going to. So if we're not going to use security through obscurity, what are we going to do? We need to build an infrastructure that's strong from the foundation, and we need to create something that's security in depth, which we'll talk about. But what do we mean when we say open standards? Well, open standards means that it's been developed by a standards body, or maybe it's been developed by a corporation and then accepted by a standards body. So OSI is an open standards body. A lot of us are used to TCP/IP, HTML, XML, the IEEE standards, as in 802.11a. These are all open standards, which mean that they're actually documented, they're available for everybody to view, to follow, so we can have intercommunication. But within security, we also have open standards that should be followed when we're building maybe an application, we're building a perimeter, we're building an enterprise security architecture overall. And some of those standards are the 7799, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. There's a lot of NIST standards that talk about how to do things correctly. We'll go into risk management, but there's specific standards and ways to do that. And the reason that they're out there is, how do you know how to build a security enterprise? How do you know how to develop an application securely? That's what the standards are for. They're best practices, and they should be followed when you're actually building or correcting something. Companies, you shouldn't be just winging it. I've worked in environments where they come up with their own cryptography algorithms. Horrible, worst thing to do. They develop their own protocols. Terrible thing to do. The reason it's bad is because they haven't been used over and over and over again by different organizations, and the flaws haven't been worked out yet. Now, so if we don't follow these if we don't follow standards, we don't have, we can't talk to each other, because protocols are really how we communicate. But since our environment is becoming more porous, as I talked about before, we need to be able to depend upon each other, the other company, that they're following standards and they're doing the right thing. One thing we'll cover in law is downstream liability. If I am dependent upon you, your company, to provide some type of service to me, you need to be doing your security in a standard, secure way, so you don't negatively affect my company, my systems, and my functionality. So throughout this whole the course, we'll be talking about different standards, but building an actual enterprise, it's important to build that right the first time, because you're doing a framework that is very difficult to go back and change when you're halfway through it. Now, there's 3 different types of control categories. That would be administrative, technical, and physical. And administrative controls is basically everything that we're covering in this domain. That would be risk management, development policies, awareness training. So these are usually called the soft controls that need to be in place. The other one is technical controls. It would be exactly what you would think. Routers, intrusion detection, encryption. Now, one control that kind of messes people up is that auditing. Auditing is considered a technical control. And on the exam, when they say auditing, they're not talking about auditors that come around and check to make sure everything's okay. Auditing means that there's actually logs being created. So auditing is a technical control, and I bring that up specifically because a lot of people usually forget that or have a hard time putting that in the category. Now, the other controls would be physical, and that would be the security guards, locks, fences. We have a whole domain on physical controls that we'll cover. So all of these have to work together. We talk about utopia. It's not the real world. Let's say in your environment where you work, do the people who do the policies communicate and know exactly what the people who are working with the technical controls versus the people who are working with the physical controls? They all get together, they have a meeting, they know what's going on? Usually not at all. Usually they're very separated, and whoever's doing the administrative type of controls, risk management, policy development, security awareness training, are usually not connected with whoever is doing the firewalls and the setting up the accounts. And then physical security is usually never involved with these two groups. And the problem is that without these groups actually communicating and working together, that creates gaps. And I've seen it many times where one group has their thing, another group has their thing, another group has their thing, but there's gaps that people can get around. So one interesting thing about the CISSP exam, I think, is that when you're studying for it, there's different levels of people that actually get a CISSP. That would be management people who would be more used to the development of policies and such. And then there's the techies who would be more the network and developer people. Now, how well do these two types of people communicate? You've got management talking to a techie. How well do they talk and communicate? They don't. They haven't over the past. Usually when somebody technical is talking to somebody who is management, all they hear is blah, 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 I need money, blah, 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 I need money. And when the techies talk to the management, they don't know what they're talking about, packets and ports and firewalls. So one thing about the CISSP exam is that everybody's learning about different parts of security, and it enables them to talk. They have to talk to actually be able to provide the necessary security at the operational, tactical, and strategic level. So I think that's really a benefit. And one of the skills that technical people really need to learn is how to make a business case. Because I've heard over years technical people complain that management's not going to do this and they don't understand about that. Well, they don't understand it in technical terms. So you're not going to move forward with developing or getting any funds or anything until you could develop a business case. And it's not only the language. You need to understand the business. Security, a company isn't in business just to stay secure. They're in business to make money. So it's important that technical people learn more about the business and the business people learn more about the technical so that they can work together to secure the corporation or the organization and help protect the company overall. Now we're going to look at the actual drivers that somebody needs to understand when they're going to build a security program, or sometimes referred to as an enterprise security architecture. We want to get to a holistic approach. We want a robust, holistic security program. And holistic security is kind of the new buzzword in the industry, which it's a good word, and we need to be holistic, which means that we have administrative controls, we have technical controls, we have physical controls, we're working at the different levels of operational, tactical, and strategic. So that's our goal. That's where we want to get. Not too many companies have it all down yet, mainly because it's an immature industry, but we're working towards it. Now, when we're actually going to build a security program, that's not easy. This is one of the things actually in my consulting world that I'm doing the most, is actually helping companies build security programs. And the reason that it's difficult is because most people are focused on technology when they look at security. But a security program requires understanding the technology, the business processes, and the people that are involved. There's three distinct things that you have to get all working together. And this is why it makes it a little bit more complex. So what do we need to understand? Well, we have to understand the legal requirements. There's federal and state laws, there's administrative laws. We have to understand legally what does the company have to do, protect what type of data, even international issues. We need to worry about their legal systems. Regulations, as I've said, is getting big. Do we have to protect medical information because we're under HIPAA? We have to protect financial information, even no matter where it goes, financial information through end-to-end when it's traveling and when it's on a computer. We also need to understand the business drivers, and this is one of the hardest things for security people, is to understand the business drivers, because a lot of security people, we came up from technology. And like I said, a company is not in business to be secure. That's not their whole thing, even though sometimes that's all security people think about. We have to help the business thrive. We can't hinder business in any way. And there's always a balance between the functionality of business requirements and the security issues. It's a constant battle. So we need to understand the business, really, if we're going to develop a whole program that's going to secure the environment. And then we have to understand the level of the risk that the company is willing to undertake. And we're going to cover risk management and go into acceptable risk levels a little bit more, and how we set them and how we use metrics and such. But these are the first things that need to be understood. And a lot of companies don't start this way. They'll just start with the technical issues, then they'll have point solutions, but they won't start with a whole architect conceptually and drawing it out first. A lot of them just start installing different applications and hiring people and not really know what their end goal is. So like I said, there's different types of laws we need to be aware of. Federal laws, state laws. Now, and they are changing because of security is so important to companies, the government, but the nation overall. We have information warfare. I mean, I was in an information warfare group. Our countries are actually, or the countries are actually fighting each other through packets. At one time, war was just about guns and cannons and, arm-to-arm battle. But not many people are aware of all the information warfare, the attacks that are taking place through technology. So because this is affecting our country overall, the government has come up with several different laws and different regulations to protect the national security, but also the economy. Now, of course, our country runs on the economy, and that's the reason that we had to put SOX in place, because companies weren't doing what they were supposed to with their, how much money they were making, and it scared off the investors, which affects the economy, which affects the whole United States or the whole country. So things are changing, and you need to be aware of the types of federal laws that an organization is under, the types of state laws. And some people are familiar with the California state law, which means that if you're doing business and you have one customer, even one customer in California, if personal data may have gotten compromised, you have to tell. You can't keep it to yourself. That's what the law is. And it started in California. They said if you even have one customer that's in California and their personal data may have been compromised, you have to tell them. Now, it's not just California. Every state is coming up with the same type of laws. And there's a potential federal law that's coming down. So privacy and protection of personal data is a really big force right now that we have to be aware of. And administrative law, which just means the regulations. The difference is laws will come down, and then they're going to be assigned to a agency like OCC or FDIC. When the law comes down, it's assigned to the regulatory agency, and then what they do is they develop regulations. So how do we know how we're staying in the bounds of the law? Well, the regulatory body, let's say OCC, will interpret the law and create these regulations. Then the corporations are to follow these regulations. And that's how we are abiding by the federal laws that are created. That's how all happens. And it's not just security. I mean, that happens in every aspect of business. So within the law issue, when we're talking about law, there's a difference between due diligence and due care. And it's important that you not only know both, but how to conduct both. Due diligence means that you are finding out about your vulnerabilities, your threats, your risks. You're doing assessments. You are doing auditing. You're finding out what you're supposed to be afraid of. So due diligence means that you're you're doing assessments, you're figuring out where your assets are, what type of risk you're under. Then due care is you're doing something about what you found out. So if you found out that you have a vulnerability because your SQL database is internet facing, then that's through due diligence because you assessed, you figured that out. Now due care is that you do something about it. You actually move it into the intranet or internal network or something. So the reason that these are important is if the company or you get pulled into court, what's going to happen is they're going to look at what kind of due diligence did you follow, what type of due care, means how responsible were you. And some examples of due diligence is understanding the dangers, carrying out assessments, and doing analysis on the assessment data, doing risk management. These are examples of due diligence. Because let's say I'm a president of a company or owner of a company, and somebody got into our database and got all these social security numbers and posted them on a website. Now, if I'm brought into court, which I probably will be, and it could be criminal or civil, they're going to ask me, what did you do to even look at and find this type of vulnerability? How could you leave your company so vulnerable? Now, if my response is, what do I know? I'm a business person. I'm just worried about making money, and I don't know anything about these ports or anything. then I'm probably going to be held liable. But if I prove that, look, I did assessments, we did risk analysis, because some things you just can't protect against. You don't have to provide 100% security, because that's actually not achievable. So in the court, if you were reasonable, if you could prove that you were reasonable, and you did follow due diligence, then there's a possibility you're not going to be fined or possibly go to jail. Now again, due care is doing the right thing, following up on the bad stuff that you uncovered when you did your assessment. So implementing the controls, training your people, putting all of the different layers of controls that are in place. So that's due care. So that's how they work together. And due diligence and due care isn't just related to information security. That's in the legal world, and it's used for any type of legal issues. Now we're talking about legal issues, and actually we're going to have a whole section that's about law and regulations. But right now what we're looking at is the drivers that you have to understand if you're going to build a security program. So we're kind of overviewing some of the legal issues that we'll get in deeper later. So I talked about due diligence, which means we got to find out what we need to be afraid of and what we need to fix. Due care means we got to fix it. Now, the legal system works on something that's called the prudent person rule. It used to be the prudent man rule, but it's not politically correct. So now it's the prudent person rule. And what this means is, let's say that I'm brought into court because I didn't carry out my corporation security properly. It negatively affected one of my partners and cost them money. Now, if I go into court, and they say, well, what did you do? If I can produce that I have a security policy, that I have a security program, that I've done my due diligence and due care, I'm acting responsible. Like I said, you can't have 100% security, so some things just happen in life that you do your best to protect yourself. But if I go in there and I don't produce that I have a policy or a security program or any of these things that I was supposed to do, even if I'm missing one of these things, then I would be irresponsible. I wouldn't be acting right, and that's how I would get a judgment against me. And how they do that is they have this person who doesn't actually exist, this imaginary person called the prudent person rule. So they think about, well, look at what I did and compare it to what a responsible person did and compare the two. So, and that's how it works a lot in civil cases. So whenever you hear the prudent person rule, it's a legal concept which indicates how you're going to be judged on the level of effort that you gave to provide the necessary protection. So it's an important concept. It depends on where you are in security, especially if you're dealing with forensics or investigation. It definitely comes into play. So we have, this is a subjective thing, but law can be subjective. They're going to be interpreted, just like regulations are interpreted. And so we need to take the right steps to make sure that we are delivering the right amount of security. Now, we talked about regulations, and a lot of people, when they hear regulations, they sigh, they hate them. But as a security person, you should love regulations, because that's mainly what's keeping you in work. It's not mainly, but it's a big thing that keeps you in work. If you've been in security as long as I have, you've constantly had to fight with management to educate them on putting security in place. And now, since the government is saying you have to put security in place, that fight is a lot easier, especially when you have regulations like Sarbanes-Oxley that could put a CEO or a CFO into jail or charge them millions of dollars in fees. So there's a lot of regulations that keep coming down, but why are they coming down? Why do we have to have these regulations continue? Because companies and organizations are not doing what they're supposed to do. if you study these regulations, a lot of the stuff was already on the books. Like Sarbanes-Oxley, a lot of that stuff was already on the books, it just was not enforced. So it's just like a parent enforcing, making companies do what they're supposed to do. So people who have to be compliant with it, not necessarily a lot of fun, but security people should really appreciate it because it makes their life a lot easier. Again, why do we need regulations? Because of the corruption that has taken place before. Our United States is getting much more serious about privacy of like health information or personal information. Europe has always been way ahead of the United States in protecting this type of information. And as I said before, once something affects the economy, that's really a big wake-up call. And Enron is a company that most people know of, but there's a lot of companies that were doing the same thing as Enron was doing, which is they were moving their expenses over to profits. They were, basically cooking the books. And so now we have to have regulations that ensure that companies don't do that anymore, and it's actually raised the cost of doing business, but that's where we are today. Now, risk management is getting very important in the industry, and because of that, the CISSP exam is covering risk management more than it used to. It even changed the name of this domain, added risk management to the name. So we're really going to go into different parts of risk management because not only are you going to get tested on it, but it's something that people don't fully understand how to do. And it's not vulnerability testing. Vulnerability testing just means you could find the holes. It's easy to do that, and then you associate them with threats, and then you've got to calculate the risks. And so we have to look at the people, process, technology. We've got to look at all of them, and how data is stored, how it's moved. We've got a lot of things that we need to understand. Why is risk management difficult? Why would it be hard to actually carry out? Risk management is difficult because first off, you're trying to read the future. What bad things are going to happen, or what could happen, and how much is it going to cost us? So you're trying to look at the future and understand what can come down the pipe and hurt us. But you also have to look at so many different variables. Like I've been saying, there's administrative, technical, physical controls, there's operation, tactical. Several companies who have bought a risk management tool because it was very impressive. It had all these formulas and it had all these calculations, and it wasn't right for them. It has to be right for your environment, qualitative or quantitative, and it has to make sense. There are tools out there right now that I think are just for show. They don't actually provide any value. So on a personal note, this isn't CISSP oriented, before you buy a tool, really investigate, because this is important. You're actually determining the risk level of the organization and the amount of money that you have to spend to reduce this risk. So this is pretty critical. Now, I talked a little bit about the acceptable risk level of a company. And acceptable risk level, what does that mean? Well, every company has a different risk appetite. That means how much risk they're willing to take on. Now, when we talk about risk appetite, that usually is meaning in the business world. Businesses that have a high risk appetite means that they're going to take on risks. They're going to be on the bleeding edge. They're going to not be conservative. In security, we usually don't use the risk appetite as much as an acceptable risk level. And that's where how we know what is enough security, because an acceptable risk level has to be set. But how do you know, how do you define that? Who comes up with the acceptable risk level? Well, we talked about the drivers that go into setting up a security program, which are the legal issues, regulatory issues, threat profile, all of these things, and the business drivers. So those things are going to help determine the type of risk that a company can take on, and management actually has to set it. Management sets the acceptable risk level, not the team. They could bring this information to management and help management set it, but management needs to make set the line. And that's how we know we can accept risk up to here and not over. And this is where we get what's enough security. So, but it's very abstract. So where is this actually documented? The acceptable risk level. Is that written in some document somewhere with that label? No, it's not. You should set that and then develop your policies. Your policies should reflect your acceptable risk levels, and then your other things under the policies just get more granular that will indicate how you're going to stay under or within that acceptable risk level. So every company has a different acceptable risk level. A grocery store compared to the NSA, huge difference. And that's going to be determined on their threat profile. What type of enemies do you have? How motivated are they? What type of assets are you protecting? So somebody needs to be involved with helping management understand the security risk level that a company is under. Again, I work with companies that they don't know what this term really means. They don't know how to set it, and they don't know what is enough security. So they end up spending too much money or not enough money and don't get the right countermeasures. But you won't, because you're going to learn what needs to be put in place. Now, one thing the team is also going to have to do is determine how are they going to collect the data. And this, like I said, is the most time-consuming part of risk management, because you have to collect all this data, which is called an assessment, and then you have to do an analysis on it. So you get the schematics of the network. You get information on the type of data, where the data is, the type of security components that are in place. And then you have to look at some of the business issues that can be affected by security. So how are we going to get it? And a lot of it's through surveys. You can interview people who would know specifically about security information. You do vulnerability tests, you do penetration tests. You do this and you get this whole big glob of data. And then you have to separate it out and know what it actually means and what to do with it. So, a big thing is, what are we protecting? What are we trying to protect? You have to identify the assets you're going to protect, otherwise you don't know where to start from. And as I said before, within corporations and even the government sector, the main asset that we're protecting today is data, because our financial information is digital. All of our information is basically digital. Social security numbers, bank accounts, all of this. But that's not all that has to be protected. So that's the first thing we have to list, is what assets are we going to have to protect, and determine what type of risk level that they're at. Now, I said that we have to identify the assets that are to be protected under our risk management. We talked about what a vulnerability is, which is a weakness or a lack of a safeguard. Now, safeguard, control, countermeasure, those are all the same thing. I don't know why we don't just use one word, but a safeguard, control, countermeasure, all the same thing. So a vulnerability is a lack of a countermeasure or a weakness. And in the assets that we're protecting, we've got to look, what are the vulnerabilities? What are the holes? What are the things that somebody can exploit? Then we need to identify the threats. Remember that you don't care about a vulnerability unless there's a threat that can exploit it. Now, the thing that actually would exploit a vulnerability is called a threat agent. So the threat is that somebody's going to find a vulnerability and exploit it. What actually does the act, what exploits the vulnerability, is a threat agent. So we need to go through and look at all the vulnerabilities, whether it has to do with physical security, malicious code, employees sabotage. That's a big thing within itself. Now, I talked about we have to determine what methodology we're going to use. Now, there's different frameworks that we'll look at. There's Octave, and there's NIST has best practices on doing risk management. But the big question is, are we going to do it qualitative or quantitative? And the answer usually is, what does management want? Management would love to have things in numbers and in monetary values, because that's how what they speak, and that's what they work in, spreadsheets and how much things are going to cost. Now, at one time, probably 3 years ago, I was very I was a big advocate for quantitative. It has to be quantitative because it's business. It has to be monetary because that's what business wants. But doing a purely quantitative analysis is very difficult. It's very time. Everybody else works for that manager. If you ask that group, what are the problems in the company, or what are we not doing right, they're probably going to say whatever that manager wants them to say. They'll be intimidated. So to get honest, real information, it's very common to use the Delphi method, which means that you collect information anonymously, because you don't really care who said what, you just need the information. So Delphi is a qualitative process, and you're collecting it from people anonymously, so it could be honest, it could be direct and more useful. Now, qualitative, again, I said it's based on ratings, and it's up to the group on the types of ratings you're going to use. It could be 1 through 10, A through F, high, medium, or low. That would be qualitative. And this is a common example. This is similar to what we saw before of actually using the squares, indicating what's a high risk, low risk. This is showing you a methodology. It's a formal methodology that has been developed in New Zealand, and it's commonly used in large corporations, and it's used for business issues, not just security risk issues. And so if you're looking for a formal risk methodology thing to follow, this is just showing you like the end product. But this is an example of one of the methodologies that are out there. So there's a different approach other than qualitative, which is quantitative. And like I said, this is monetary values, you use percentages, and we're going to step through how that actually works and some of the formulas that are commonly used in the industry. So what's the first thing to actually calculate is a single loss expectancy, the SLE value. And the formula to come up with that is the asset value times the exposure factor. Now, we've talked about the asset value. Remember, it's not just what we paid for it. It was all the other things, how much it costs to replace, what would our adversaries do with it, what are our liabilities if this asset gets compromised. So we cover the asset value. Now we multiply that times the exposure factor. The exposure factor is the percentage of damage we think will take place if this vulnerability is exploited. Because what we're doing is we're looking at one asset and one threat and calculating how much this could potentially cost the company. So on this asset, if this vulnerability was exploited, what would that cost? That's a single loss expectancy. That's just one thing. So, and it's important that you know not only these formulas, but you may be given a simple example where you have to actually do the calculations yourself. Now, what we need to look at also is how often do we think that this would take place? And remember what I said that the risk definition is. It's the business impact and the probability. What is the probability of something of this taking place? And in quantitative approaches, we call that the annual rate of occurrence. Within a 12-month period, how often do we think that's going to happen? So ARO is the frequency. How often do we think that's going to take place? Now the ARO is an annual metric. So if we think it's going to take place one time in a year, the ARO is 1.0. If we think it's going to take place once in 10 years, then it's 0.1, etc. So the ARO is the frequency. It's based on annual, 12 months. If we think it's going to take place 3 times in a year, what would that be? The ARO would be 3. So now we need to put all this together. The single loss expectancy, again, and I'm going to repeat this because I've taught it a lot, and I know that people miss what we're actually doing. Unfortunately, what a lot of people do is they memorize this for the exam. They don't understand how it really works in the real world. They get their CISSP, but they don't know how to use this information. So SLE means that we have one asset, and we think that if something bad happens, let's say a tornado, this percentage of that asset would be affected. That's the SLE. Now we need to look at, well, what's the probability? How often do we determine the budget that's needed for the security program overall? It's going to tell us, it's a roadmap. This is what we have to do first. This is the potential loss we can go through. This is the potential, or this is the budget that we actually need. That's why we do the ALE. It's not a specific value. So, and what I mean by that is, it's not going to be like you're absolutely going to lose this specific amount of information. It's a guesstimation because you're looking into the future. So this is potentially how much we can lose. So again, remember I said the definitions between the different concepts within security are important. You have to identify the vulnerabilities. You identify if they have any threats that can exploit them. You calculate the risks, either based on qualitative or quantitative, and that lets you categorize the risk based on importance, on what you need to put money towards first. So let's go through a quick calculation. If we have an e-commerce site and we have a value of $300,000 and we think that there's going to be 40% damage, let's say if somebody hacked in or a virus or something. So we'll just say hacker because that's what most people are interested in. So we have our e-commerce sites worth $300,000, and we estimate that if this exploit happens, that it's going to cause 40% damage. So the first thing we have to calculate is the SLE. So it's $300,000 multiplied by the exposure factor. So that would be 0.4 because it's 40%. The SLE is $120,000. That's for one time. If it happens one time, we could potentially lose that much amount of money, or that's how much we have to spend to recover. But of course, threats can happen more than once, so we have to figure out the probability. That's where the ARO comes in. We have the SLE, we multiply it times the ARO, which is how often we think it's going to take place. And if we think it's going to take place once, then it's 1.0, and our ALE is $120,000. So what this means is, for this specific vulnerability, we're not going to spend over $120,000 to protect against it. We're not going to spend $300,000 because we don't even have that potential loss. Again, that's how it helps us set our budget for the type of controls that we need to put in place. So you walk through an example yourself. If we have a facility that's worth $650,000, and if a tornado comes through, is $78,000. After we put the countermeasure in place, the new ALE is $20,000. The actual cost of the countermeasure is $60,000. Is this the right decision? Is this the right countermeasure for us? The answer is no, because we'd be in the negative. In our cost-benefit analysis, we would be spending more for the countermeasure than we could potentially lose. So this is a very good exercise to go through. Even if companies don't do the exact numbers, even if you don't use this exact formula, what's really good is that you understand the value of an asset, all that goes into that, and that you understand when you buy a countermeasure, it's not just how much you're going to pay for it. Those concepts are very important. Now, if you put them in a formula, great, and for the CISSP exam, you're going to need to know the formulas. But a lot of this stuff is very good, even if you understand it conceptually, how to put it in place in your environment. So again, a lot of companies just put in the countermeasures that they think they've heard about, or it's the new thing, or they're not educated or informed decisions. A lot of purchasing is not informed decisions. And again, that's not because people are stupid, it's just that it's hard to know all of this stuff. This is an immature market, and we're all learning. Now, with the control that we're going to put in place for the countermeasure, there's several things that we need to look at, not just how much is it going to cost, but there's a whole list of things that we also need to look at. Is it going to default to least privilege? Is it flexible? Does it provide uniform protection? Is it modular in nature? Modular is a big deal now in the industry, that you can put it in, update it if you need to, and not affect all the systems around it. Does it require human intervention? Means do people have to do something, which is always a bad thing. Anytime people have to be involved, that's when mistakes happen. Auditing is a big thing that needs to be in place. Since we're under regulations, it's become even more important. So does this countermeasure, does it have auditing functionality? Is it usable? Has it been tested? Can we test it? And that's a big, a lot of companies should do some type of bake-offs or test products before they put it in place. Some companies are afraid to ask vendors to get a copy of the product, but they should be able to give you a copy. You put it in the lab and have go through tests to make sure that it's not going to negatively affect your systems or your business functionality. So quantitative analysis, what's the benefit of that? Well, we're able to give management the report in what they want, which is in monetary values, it's in percentages, it's scientific, it's objective. So these are the benefits of a quantitative analysis. What are the disadvantages of this? There's an amazing amount of information or data that you have to gather to properly carry out a quantitative analysis. For example, there are certain tools that are just quantitative, and they'll want you to figure out what is the confidentiality cost for an asset, integrity cost, availability cost. There's all of these things that you have to figure out or collect. It's a lot of information, very detail-oriented. It's hard to carry out manually because there's so much information, and because mathematics are involved. That's usually done through tools. It's not very flexible, and there's no real standard of exactly how it should be done. So quantitative, there's good and bad about it, but the main thing you need to know for CISSP is what is it, what are the formulas, and what do those formulas mean. Now qualitative, what's great about that? Well, you're assigning values. You don't have to gather all this information and do all this mathematical work. You're assigning some type of ratings, high, medium, or low. That's a lot easier. It's much more flexible, and
you don't have to go through as much work, really. You have to gather the data, but you don't have to go through all the work that you do with quantitative, with all the calculations and such.
So what's the disadvantages of qualitative? It's subjective because it's a gut feeling.
Or you may need another control to be able to reduce the risk.
Now, one thing that's not commonly done in this risk program approach is an uncertainty analysis. What an uncertainty analysis is how much confidence do you have in the data that you put into the formulas or the data that you collect? Because some of the data you can know for fact based on maybe historical events. Maybe you've collected metrics over 3 years and you have confidence in that type of data. Maybe you're actually getting data that you have nothing to base on. It's going on a gut feel. So an uncertainty analysis has to do with assigning the amount of trust or in the information that you're actually using. Because when you take this information, you go to management, they need to understand that you're not going to necessarily lose this much amount of money if you're doing quantitative. It's a guess. We're doing the best that we can on understanding our potential risks that we could run into. Now, there's 4 ways of dealing with risk, and this is not up to the group who just did the analysis. How it goes is you get a team, you identify the assets, you identify the vulnerabilities and threats, you calculate the risks, you come up with potential solutions, and then you hand it over to management. You give them the information. These are potential risks. It's up to them to determine what to do with the risk. It's their responsibility, nobody else's, because they're ultimately liable. So there's 4 ways of dealing with risk: mitigation, transfer, acceptance, and avoidance. A lot of companies don't either understand that those 4 ways of dealing is available, or they don't use it. Most of them don't understand. So a lot of times I've seen many companies have have a large consulting company come in and do a big risk analysis and all these pretty pictures and pie charts and everything, and then they do nothing with it because they don't know what to do with it. So you need to know what to actually do with the data you just collected. What do you do with this risk?
So if you're going to you put a control in place, that means you're going to mitigate. You're going to reduce your risk. Put a control in place, you mitigate. Now you can actually transfer your risk, which means like buying insurance, which means that this risk is too big to sit on our shoulders. It's too much for us to take on. So there is cyber insurance. There's different types of insurance that deals with anything that could take place and that can negatively affect your revenue. So that's one way, is transferring the risk. Another way is acceptance. You accept the risk. You know about it, you accept it. And really, the acceptance of the risk is when the countermeasure costs more than your potential loss. So that's when you usually just say, okay, we understand the risk and we'll accept it. Now, another way is avoidance. And what avoidance means is you're going to stop whatever is causing the risk. So, for example, if the team has come up with a risk that you're allowing your users to use instant messaging and it's going through your firewall, well, instant messaging is a way to pass viruses and bad stuff just like any other protocol. So you can choose to accept it because maybe there's a business case that you actually need it. You can mitigate it, meaning that you still allow your users to use it, but maybe you set up your own internal instant messaging server and have it controlled. Or you avoid it. You say there's no business use for using instant messaging, so it's not allowed. So avoidance just means you get rid of what actually is causing the risk. Now, risk acceptance. This, I think, is huge in the industry because most organizations are accepting risk, or they've delegated who's going to accept the risk or deal with the risk, and people just accept it. Like when I said that you need to delegate who's responsible for risk, and companies that have the business unit managers or the department heads that are responsible for the risk within their department, what I've seen is a lot of times that department head or that business manager doesn't understand or doesn't have the time or has enough other things to do, and they just accept the risk and they don't understand what they're accepting. So when you accept risk, it needs to be based on cost, where we did the cost benefit analysis with the control. Pain means that if we allowed this risk to exist, how is it going to hurt us? What are we going to? How is it going to affect us? And visibility, reputation. If we just accept this risk and our customers find out about it, how's that going to hit, or how is that going to affect our reputation? And it shouldn't be a surprise decision. You should have a very calculated or a process that you're going through, which is what we're talking about. We're talking about building a whole security risk management program, and you're not just winging it. So this is what we started with, and this is what we'll end with in risk management, where we have to have a team. We develop a scope of what we're to be protecting. We come up with our method, which is, are we using quantitative or qualitative? We identify the tools that we're going to use. The tools are beneficial because they'll reduce the amount of work we have to do. We have to understand the acceptable risk level. What's enough security? Then we collect the information. We identify the assets. We assign values to those assets. We identify the vulnerabilities and threats. We calculate the risks. We do cost-benefit analysis and an uncertainty analysis. And then we hand it over to management. And management decides, are we going to mitigate, transfer, accept, or avoid? And so this is not only good for the exam, this is a very good roadmap to use in a corporation or organization that's trying to set up a risk program.
Okay, so up to now we've laid out the legal requirements for the organization, the regulatory requirements, we have the acceptable risk level, we've identified our assets, we've calculated our risk. We've got all this information, and we took it to management. Management decided what to do with the risk. And then what's the next step? What do we do now? Well, now we have to build an actual security program, and there's a few different categories that we're going to talk about in building a whole security program. Some people don't know what the term security program really means. Another term for it could be enterprise security architecture.
So one of the most important things about your security program is that it's a layered approach. And that means you have several different barriers that somebody has to go through to be able to get to the asset. And it depends upon the sensitivity of that asset, how many barriers there are. So it's a very sensitive data, let's say. You've got physical barrier, you've got firewall, maybe another firewall, you've got access control, encryption. All of these different layers somebody would actually have to break through to be able to get to your asset. Now, this is a very common concept in security, and one thing that organizations don't do is that they don't do the layered approach around the whole environment, because they'll do the firewall, through the DMZ. You have a couple firewalls and your access control and such, but they don't realize that remote access, whoever's coming through remote access, they don't have enough layers there. Or the wireless network, they don't have enough layers there. So it's not just having enough barriers or enough layers of protection, it's having them in the right place where you're most vulnerable.
Now, we certainly don't want any surprises when we're developing our security program, which actually happens a lot. The surprises are when you don't collect enough data. Once you start developing your security program, a lot of things come up. If you don't do your research and find out how the business works, find out where the sensitive data is, find out where the sensitive data travels, the in and out points of your environment. If you don't find all of this stuff out and just start building your security program, you're going to run into things, and you're going to start going one way and looking at point solutions. So really the most important thing is that assessment, going through, identifying the risks, and then start building.
So you can look at the security program as the foundation for your whole enterprise security architecture. And just like any foundation, it's going to support a lot of different things. And I said earlier that I've seen companies where they do the best they can, but it's hard to build a security program when you don't understand it holistically, because it's not just technical, it's the processes that have to be understood, it's the business issues. So you need to take the time to build it properly, and then if you build it properly, then you don't have to go back and try to fix things. You could build on top of it, and you've got security through the different layers. Now, when companies want to build a security program or they need to secure their environment, a lot of them don't know how to start. And that's where you get into this whole analysis paralysis. You're going into meetings, you're collecting data, and you don't do anything with that data. And that's when you go to point solutions. This whole process is it's easily mapped out, and you should follow it kind of A to Z. And so you understand who the shareholders are of the security program and who's ultimately responsible. You come up with your strategies and your principles of what is our acceptable risk level, what is it we have to protect, and then you develop your security architecture. Now, a lot of people think a security architecture is the technical architecture, but it's not. It's your security architecture is the actual framework that you're going to use, and I talked about like 7799 is a framework, and there's some others out there that are very useful, but you have to figure out which framework are we going to use. Then you come up with your organizational structure, which means who's going to be responsible for what. You have to assign roles and responsibilities. Then you could develop your technical framework, because technology is supposed to enforce what your strategy is. And technology is just one piece that enforces that. Then you come up with your baselines and your standards. You come up with your compliancy, make sure that you're compliant with the policy, the different laws. You come up with assurance. Now, what assurance means is that you know that the security things are working as they're supposed to be working. How are you going to check on that? That's monitoring and auditing. And more companies are developing security metrics. Security metrics are very important because they could track how well your security components are doing, how well your security initiatives are. You know, in the past, a lot of security professionals have had a hard time, or somebody in the organization going to management and say, you know, I need some more money for this. I need, you know, we need to roll out IPS or IDS or whatever. And management would say, well, I just gave you $200,000 last year. Why should I give you some more money? And it's really hard to sell security because it's basically like insurance. If everything goes good, nothing happens. So it's been a hard sell to management when you need funds or you need to build things that they don't fully understand. And that's one benefit of setting up metrics. You can show that when you put a control in, you could actually have metrics to indicate the amount of successful or unsuccessful attacks, the amount of successful or unsuccessful viruses that got in. Another metric is the amount of time, operational time it took for to clean up or to recover, amount of downtime, amount of revenue. So metrics are becoming more and more important and mature in the environment.
Now, there is a difference between functional and assurance requirements. Functional process, and most companies, I don't think anybody's fully there yet, but that's our utopia. That's what we're working towards.
Now, in the past, security usually came from IT, as I said, and that's a bottom-up approach. And the problem with a bottom-up approach is you have people in IT who they actually don't know all the risks to the company. They understand the technical risks, but they don't understand all of the risks, and they don't understand the full business. They don't have the purse strings. They don't have the recognition. Security needs to come from the top down because it's senior management that can enforce security standards, can enforce that people will be doing what they're supposed to be doing. They have the money, and they have a larger view of the organization. Instead of just one component like IT, they can understand an organization and all the different types of risk and how it can affect the company. So security needs to come from the top down because the top is the one that's liable in the end.
So I've fought with management over a lot of years, and I'm just thankful that security is now becoming into more people's consciousness, and they have to think about this at different levels. But people who've been in this industry for quite some time know what a struggle it's been to get management to key in and understand these things. Now, I said that there's different models or frameworks that you can use to build a security program, and the most popular one it's called BS 7799. That's British Standard, but now it's been accepted by the industry body, so it's ISO 7799. And if you look at the different things that fall under these guidelines, they map pretty well to the CISSP domains, because within the CISSP domains, we actually go over what needs to take place in every security program. So if most people or organizations aren't going to know how to build a security program, so that's why they laid this out. like I said, it was British Standard 7799, and it was a de facto standard. De facto just means that it's a good idea, so everybody starts doing it. And then it can move into an actual standard, which this has done. And that's what the ISO, that's International Standards Organization. So this, companies actually get certified against this, and the 7799 is going through some upgrades or being a little bit modified by the ISO group.
Now, as if things weren't confusing enough, what you'll usually see when we're looking at this type of thing is ISO I7799, because the British Standard 7799 was actually broken into 3 parts, and the CISSP exam covers really just the first 2 parts. In the British Standard 7799, the first part talks about the controls that could be used, the countermeasures that should be used. And the second part talks about how to actually build a security program using the controls that are in part 1. So since we're kind of going through this flux, the numbers are actually changing, which are confusing some people.
So what you'll commonly see today is ISO 17799-2005. And that means it's a standard, an ISO standard. They're still using the 7799, and 2005 is when it was created. That's for the first part. For the second part, they've already moved away from 7799, and you'll see ISO 27001. And that represents the second part. It gets too confusing. So 7799, it basically had 3 parts. And as ISO is kind of bringing under its wings, it's moving it to its own numbering scheme. And so that's why people are kind of confused with it. So if you see ISO I7799, that deals with the first part. That's the actual controls. If you see ISO 27001, that's the second part. That's how to actually build a security program. Because security is so important, the organization, the ISO organization, is coming up with its whole series. It's very common to like the 9000 series with quality, if you've ever had to go through being compliant with the 9000 series. Whole series, a whole bunch of numbers that indicate exactly what needs to take place. So the ISO has come up with a series starting off with 27000 that has a vocabulary of all the terms that it's going to be used in that series. So again, right now what you'll usually see is ISO I7799, which represents the controls that could be used, and then ISO 27001, which represents the security program. Now, it's the security program standard that companies can choose to get certified against. So you can have an outside auditor who's already been blessed, by ISO that they could do this. They'll come in and see if you're actually following the standard and are compliant with it, and then you can brag to your customers to say that somebody else says we're secure. I mean, that's the reason that you actually do it, is provide confidence with your customers and your partners. Now, something else that's getting a lot more limelight is called COBIT. And this is the Control Objectives for Information and Related Technology, COBIT. And this is a whole structure for really how to set up a IT infrastructure. It's not necessarily just about security, although it has a portion that deals with security. It's about all the things that should take place in a IT infrastructure. In COBIT, there's 4 domains. It's broken down into planning and organization, acquisition and implementation, delivery and support, and monitoring. So it has all of these different domains,
And within security, we're usually just looking at the delivery and support domain that ties into the security issues. Now, COBIT is great.
The infrastructure library. And this is not something that's directed at security, even though there's a security component in it. The goal of ITIL is to run the IT department in a very efficient way to perform its services to its customers. And its customers are the internal groups within the company. So ITIL is really about the IT department and making sure that it gets requests and fulfills them properly, and they're very efficient and effective. And there is a component of security in it, but it's something that you should be aware of because it's becoming more and more important because we have to save money. There's a lot of wasted money and wasted time within IT departments, and we have to make sure that they map properly to business processes. Now, security governance is another term that is in the industry, and I feel sorry for a lot of people that they get very confused. In fact, Information Security Magazine asked me to write an article about what is 7799, what is Octave, what is HIPAA, what are all these acronyms that are being thrown around, because companies these days, the business people, not only do they not necessarily understand technology or the security, but they already have their job. They already have a job, and now security is becoming part of their job, and it could be very complex, and they don't necessarily have the time to do all the research and live and breathe security like the professionals. So, another thing is, what is the security governance? This is another term that is very subjective to a lot of people. They don't know how to necessarily articulate it. So security governance is it's like corporate governance. Corporate governance means that the board and senior management is overseeing and responsible that the organization is running properly, that nobody's cooking the books and all that. So security governance is that security is being controlled, and it's being done properly. It's not just in IT. It's a board issue. It's a senior management issue. It's spread out across the different process owners or the business units. So security governance is something that's kind of wishy-washy, where some people don't know what it is, but it's out in the industry being discussed a lot. And I put together an actual article describing security governance, and what I did is, instead of use the common terminology that's used to explain what this is, I give an example.
So when you're looking at security governance, you can look at two different companies, and they both have firewalls, they both have access control, they both have a security team, they both have a CISO in place. So it seems like they're both the same. They're doing the same amount of work in security, they're performing the same. But that really is not true. When you look closer, you can have company A that actually has a security governance program, and that means that everybody who is supposed to be involved is involved. The board, senior management, the different process owners. The other company, it's just an IT. They don't have the security spread out, and senior management isn't taking it seriously. Another thing is that the executive in the company A, the executives are setting the stage. They're setting the tone for security. Company B, you have a CISO who has all the responsibility and liability, but no support, no funds. And for a long time, and even today, CISOs are commonly the sacrificial lamb because the senior management isn't taking responsibility. And company A that has security governance, They would understand the business processes. They understand where the security risks are within the business processes. In Company B, they haven't documented or looked at the processes. That's a big difference. In Company A that has security governance, they hold their people accountable. They hold not only the CISO, but the process owners and even the employees. In this other company, they have policies, but they don't ever back them up. So you could see the difference between two different companies. One has security governance and one doesn't. And another thing with security governance is you have the metrics in place and you're continually trying to improve and you're monitoring. So security governance is really becoming a big thing in the industry because regulations are requiring it. And a lot of people don't understand what actually it is. It means doing the right thing, doing all the things that we're talking about, especially in this domain, and being responsible, carrying out due diligence and due care.
Now, we've talked about risk management. We've looked at some frameworks that could be used to set up a security program. We talked about what a security program is. Now we have to kind of start filling it in. And in the components, especially in security management practices, would be the development of the policies, the standards, the baseline, the guidelines, roles and responsibilities.
So some people aren't actually familiar with the policies. Some people are at a very technical level and they never see the policies. And they don't realize how many there really are. Some people think there's just one policy that affects and addresses everything. Most organizations have several different policies that address, specific issues of how you're going to deal with sensitive data or physical security. So there's a lot of different policies usually involved.
Now, the overreaching policy is the organizational policy, and that addresses the business needs, the laws, regulations. But this is the directives for management. Basically, the policy is what management says the role of security in this company. What is the role of security in this company? So there's different types of policies, but there is usually one overreaching policy itself.
So in this organizational policy, what's there? Well, we have the strategic direction of what security management is all about. We identify the compliancy issues. We define the actual security program itself. You define the roles, not individuals. You don't call out individuals. You define the roles and their responsibilities. You define the actual security team. So in a way, it's a high-level roadmap, but it is very high level. A policy is not specific because it has to cover so many different departments and so many different processes and different technologies. If your policy was specific, let's say about a type of firewall, you'd have to change it once you did a refresh. So a policy is almost like a law. It has to be interpreted.
So the organizational or the overall policy works as the framework for the security program. And what that means is it's the directives for management. They've laid out in the policy, it lays out all the things we went over. And this is what you go to when there's a question. After a security program is put in place, if there's ever a question of how to deal with something, or if there's somebody doesn't agree with some of the procedures or standards, you always go back to the policy to see what it says, because the whole thing is you have to be compliant with the policy. That's the whole goal of all the security stuff within an organization. And it has to be a good policy that covers all the responsibilities of security. Now, like I said, there's several different types of policies. There's individual policies that are called issue-specific policies, also called functional policies. And they are going to address specific things that the overall policy can't get into. For example, email is only supposed to be used for business use. You can't use it for personal use. There's no confidential information that can be passed through email, or internet use can only be for business use, what to do in physical emergencies. So there's individual policies that deal with individual specific items.
So within every policy, you'll have a purpose of what the policy is, you'll have the scope, what this policy actually covers, and then you'll lay out the requirements. And there's a lot of great templates and policies out there that can be used instead of starting from scratch.
So we have organizational policy, we have what does good mean, what does bad mean, what are the ramifications for being bad. So that's why we need much more specific things. So a standard is something that has to be enforced, it has to be followed. And there's a lot of different standards, like employees have to have a badge with their ID, their photo ID always available. Guests can't walk around without being with an employee with them. And then there's standards that deal specifically with technology on what the configurations absolutely have to be. So standards have to be followed. If they're followed, then that means that the policy is being enforced.
So within the policy, so within the standard you'll have laid out exactly who does what or what needs to happen. And something that's very common is a configuration standard, and that goes through the exact configurations and the settings, and they're usually pretty large documents that are very detail-oriented.
Now, baseline is, for test purposes, you need to know that a baseline is the minimum level of security required. And what that means is that we have an acceptable risk level set, and let's say within the accounting department, we can only use systems that have a C2 rating. Now, if you're familiar with Orange Book, you know what that means, a C2 rating. We can only process top secret information on mandatory access control systems. So baseline means we have to have at least this much security. Now we can go above this, we could have more security on top of it, but we have to at least have this much. So really, if we follow all the standards, that means that we're hitting that baseline. So if we follow all the standards properly, we are providing the minimum level of security that's required. And then, as I said today, we're getting into metrics to be able to define these and keep track of the security levels a little bit better.
Now, there's a lot of products out there that will provide you different metrics, and those are important to understand how well you're doing in reducing the vulnerabilities, reducing your risk overall. And this is outside of CISSP, but what's important is that within your company, you develop standards and metrics that makes sense to your environment. Because a lot of my customers are very concerned about what metrics. They don't know what metrics to come up with, and they say, well, what's used in the industry, or what are companies using? And it really doesn't matter what metrics you're using as long as you stay with them, as long as they're standard across the board, because they have to represent something within your organization, and that's what you're going to report up to management to indicate how well things are going on. But metrics are used to indicate how well we're doing against our baselines. So we set our baselines, the metrics, we keep track of those to say, yep, we're hitting our baseline, or no, we're not hitting our baseline. We need to put another control in place.
And then there's guidelines, which are just suggestions on how to deal with different issues. They're not something that has to be followed. They're guidelines or suggestions. Now, there's guidelines in the industry, and some companies develop their own guidelines internally, because you can't have a standard for everything. So maybe a guideline explains what a private key and a public key, how they work, and how they work within a PKI. That could be an example. And then you have procedures, which are step-by-step instructions of how to do something. And this is really where most companies fall down, is to have complete sets of procedures. Because there are a lot of writing, there's a lot of stuff to put down. But the reason that you should have procedures is to ensure that things are happening in a standardized way. Would you want somebody to set up a server any way that they want to? Or should they set up a server and have the same configurations as the other servers? So it's all about standardization.
So if we look at how these components come together, let's say we have a policy that unauthorized users should not have access to sensitive data. And a policy would be that high level. Then you'd have a standard that says users must have a smart card and a PIN number to be authenticated and then authorized to access this sensitive information. That's the standard. The baseline is the number of unauthorized accesses allowed, because really you can't have 100% security like I've talked about. So you have to set a baseline that's a clipping level. It's an actual threshold. Then you have a guideline that explains what identification and authorization is, and potentially how to use smart cards. And then you have procedures on how to actually configure like a database that controls where the sensitive data is. So this is how they all work together. And again, the policy is the management directives, it's high level, and all of these other things are developed to provide meat for us to actually know what to do to be compliant with the policy. So the policy should not just be known by the security group, and that happens. If you go into an organization, you say, let me see your security policies, some people will never know where they are. Everybody should at least know how to get access to them. They should be on like an intranet site or something. But the CEO and the board actually needs to bless them. They need to bless the policies that are put in place. And so we just see how what the relationship is, that standards, procedures, baselines, and guidelines come from the security policy and support it. That's the relationship.
Now, what's senior management's role in security? We actually talked about this a little bit because I said that security should be top down, not bottom up. Security management needs to run, they don't do day in, day out operational stuff, but they have to make sure that people are staying on security. They have to make sure it's continually funded as needed, that it doesn't just stall, because a lot of security initiatives start and then aren't completed. It's actually management's responsibility to enforce this, whatever the new security initiative is. And the whole thing about security, the biggest, hardest thing to do is change culture. Implementing technology is the easiest thing to do, but people are really usually the problem. And senior management has to be behind security to help that culture change so that you can have some type of enforcement on the rules that are to be followed. So we need to understand if you're actually practicing security the way that you are supposed to. A lot of times you'll have gaps that you want to get fixed, but you don't have the funds, or you don't have the acknowledgement, or nobody's looking at it or paying attention to it. So once auditors come around, they can mark you off on that, and then you can go to management and say, okay, not only do I say that we need to do this, the auditors say that we need to do this. And auditing is becoming a bigger thing because of all the regulations. Most large organizations have internal auditors that are ensuring the compliancy to the policy. And then there's external auditors that will come and make sure the company is compliant with the regulations. Now, one thing that's important to understand is who is approving access to any type of resource. Unfortunately, in some environments, it's up to IT. They're setting up the accounts, they're assigning the privileges and the permissions, and that's not how it should be, because they don't have that liability. It should be somebody at a higher level that actually assigns access. And we're going to get more into that in identity management in Domain 2. But right now, what I want to get across is there's data owners who will set the classification. By them setting the classification, that indicates who can access this data. It's not IT's job or anybody else's job to say who can access this data. It's the data owner. They're responsible for not what it means to set the classification. It means who can actually access this. Now we're going to get into information classification. In a lot of environments that I've worked in, they've had information classification policies, but that was it, just a policy.
So if you're actually going to implement information classification, you really need to set up a program. And this isn't as easy as it may sound if you haven't been through it, because data is everywhere. You have to go through and figure out what is sensitive, what classification level does it need to be at, who should access it, where does the data reside, where does it go through the actual network. So you have to have your goals mapped out, and it has to map to your business needs, of course.
So one of the biggest things that's happening in the industry today is data leakage, and that directly has affiliated with information classification, because a lot of companies just have an information classification policy and that's it. They don't know how to set up a structured system. They don't necessarily know how to enforce classification levels. They don't have the structure to actually do it. So because of that, and because they don't have tight access control, sensitive data is leaving. It's going through emails, employees are collecting it, people are losing laptops, and constantly getting in the headlines.
So the loss of sensitive data actually happens so much, it doesn't really make the headlines anymore. I know recently somebody, actually in my family, said, "Oh, did you hear about whatever company lost, 300,000 Social Security numbers?" And I didn't know, but what they didn't realize is it happens like every day. It happens all the time. We don't necessarily know about it, but companies are losing sensitive data left and right, and it's not unless it gets to the news do we find out about it. And some companies are losing data and they don't even know it. They've been giving the hackers Social Security numbers, sensitive information for years, and nobody's recognized it yet.
So in your classification program, you have to set up levels. Now, in the military and the government, there's very strict levels that are already set up: top secret, secret, confidential. Now, in the commercial sector or the corporate world, hard drives, and it still has sensitive data there. So then you need to define who the owners are, who's responsible for the different data sets, and then you come up with the level of protection that's required per classification. So if you have confidential, it requires this level of protection. If you have private, it requires this level of protection. And you need to integrate it into your security awareness training and any other training programs, because users need to know what to do or how to deal with this type of information. If something's marked confidential, who can have it? Who can't have it? How am I supposed to move it around? So you have to inform the people who will be working with the data. So the first thing you do is develop a policy. Policy is at a high level, and it's going to lay out a lot of the things that we just talked about. The data owner, what the data owner's responsibility is, what the classifications that are going to be used, what the definition is per classification. So you have a policy that outlines everything that's been decided upon. And then you have to have your procedures and guidelines and standards. So we have to spell out, how do we classify information? How do we change the classification? Because sometimes things can be declassified, or sometimes it becomes more sensitive. How do we destroy the data? And another domain, we're going to talk about how to securely destroy sensitive data. But these are all the things that have to be considered. And that's why it sounds like data classification is an easy process, but there's actually a lot involved.
So on the classification levels, it's important to not have too many of them. Say you had 15 classification levels. Well, that's too crazy. It's too confusing. Nobody would know what to put, what kind of data goes where. So you don't want too many, but you also don't want too small of an amount, because they're not going to be taken seriously. So, a lot of companies actually have 3. It's very common for corporations to have 3 classification levels. It's important that they're very distinct, so there's no confusion on the type of data that goes under that classification. So those classification levels should not overlap.
Carry out their tasks. Now, they also need to understand how to do this process. You have to train the data owners on how to use the criteria, understand the business impact of different types of sensitive data, and put it into the classification. So you can't just on paper say somebody's a data owner and that's it. It's just paper. So as I said before, the sensitive data must be labeled properly and have handling procedures. How are we supposed to handle this? If it's a digital, if it's in paper, who is supposed to handle it? What are the procedures? There should be markings. If it's classified, it should have that on the actual paper or on the digital format. And this is important that, it gets back to that whole due care thing. If sensitive information got out and then one of your customers came to sue you, you'll go to court and they'll say, well, what did you do? And if you didn't do things like this, if you didn't set up an information classification program, if you didn't train the people how to do it, you didn't properly mark what was sensitive and what wasn't, then you'll be found liable and you'll be in the headlines, which is not a good thing.
So you need to test your classification program. Make sure that the people know what they're supposed to be doing. Do they have the sensitive data out so everybody can view it? Do they talk about it over the telephone? Do they email it? Do they put it on their USB, jump drives? So you need to actually follow up and not assume that you can come up with a policy, come up with a program, and then it's all going to work fine. So how do you actually test them? And I tell companies it's good to actually put this type of stuff in your internal auditing procedures. So this is something else they're looking at.
So what's the weakest link in security? It's always people. It's not the technology. It's always the people who don't follow the policies, don't follow the standards that have been set.
Education and experience. Those are two things that people most lie about. What amount of education they have, amount of experience. And then you need to have termination processes and procedures. So if somebody's going to be laid off or they're going to be fired, you go through an exit interview, which means you explain to them by themselves what's going on. Companies that want to protect their sensitive information, when they actually hire the employee, they'll have them sign a non-disclosure agreement saying that you can't share our secrets. Now, at the termination process, you might want to remind them, look, you signed this, and you're legally responsible not to share our secrets. You also need to turn off their accounts so that they can't have access. They need to be escorted out of the building. They need to return all of the possessions for the company. So you need to have these procedures because, you know, there's been so many bad things that's happened in the past where people would get fired and they didn't follow these strict procedures, and then, you know, they went off and shot people or did, you know, terrible things. So it seems kind of cold, especially when it's just a layoff, that like guards are actually taking the poor employee who just got laid off to the door, but it's protecting the company and the employees overall.
So there should be some type of a checklist that actually is followed. The HR is getting, you know, like I said, most corporations are getting a lot better about following specific things on hiring and firing. It doesn't happen as loosey-goosey as it used to before. Now, one thing that's important, not only in the industry, it's important for the exam also, but an unfriendly termination. So when you know that you have a problem child, you know that you're firing somebody and they're not going to be very happy about it and they're going to be revengeful, you need to, of course, follow all of the things that I talked about. But one of the most important things is to get that account, their account to the network, turned off or disabled. And this is, you know, the companies have been in very interesting positions where I remember one company who was, they had a network administrator who, you know, thought he was great. He thought he was God, and he wasn't very nice to people. And so when people complained, management brought him in and says, hey, look, you need to, you know, you need to shape up or we're getting rid of you. And what the network administrator said is, well, if you get rid of me, I've got, you know, this place, you know, I've got logic bombs, I've got Trojan horses. So if you get rid of me, you know, there's things I could do. So management was scared, and they didn't fire him. And then he continued with, you know, not being good to people and everything. And they did fire him. And then he erased 2 of their whole databases, all their information. And that's just one story. There's a lot of stories that we don't hear about that people carry out. That's because they have to have privileged access to our sensitive data. They're the ones, you know, like the administrators or the engineers have direct access. So you need to really understand who has what type of access, especially in our environments where we don't have an overall identity management access control program, which means you can pull access from all systems at one time. A lot of our environments, you have accounts at different systems that you have to make sure are properly disabled. So if it's an unfriendly termination, it's important to make sure that they don't have access to the system right away.
Now, security awareness training needs to take place, and this is something that's a lot of regulations are demanding, and companies that don't have it in place are now actually working hard to get it in place because the auditors have put it down that they don't have it. Now, security awareness is for everybody. That's for everybody in the company, and it's kind of high level. Talks about the policies and classification levels and such. And one thing that some people don't realize is that security awareness training isn't just training the people, it's actually a legal protection. This is a way, say you have an employee and they do something bad. they share confidential information, they download pornographic information or something, and then you want to go and fire them. And they say, I didn't know. I didn't know that that was bad, or I didn't know that that was the right thing to do. If you did your security awareness training, you could say, yes, you did know, and follow through, because there's been a lot of companies that didn't have policies in place, they didn't have security awareness in place, and when they fired somebody for doing something wrong, the employee came back and sued and actually won. So security awareness isn't just about training, it's also legal protection. Now, the different levels of people need different types of skills. So there's actually training that'll take place, and some regulations are making sure that you have the right skill level of the people in different roles. And then there's actually education, where that's usually what you're looking at, degrees and such. So there's a difference between education, training, and a security awareness. So looking at the security awareness, we're just learning information. In training, it's the how. How do we actually carry out security activities? And that's more knowledge. And then the education is why. Have deeper understanding of why this stuff actually takes place. So the main thing is, who are you putting in these different roles to protect the company? What is it that they need to know, and to what level?
So as I said, that security awareness is not only teaching people what the rules are, it's also a due care thing with liability. And you should do several different things. You shouldn't just have, an annual security awareness class. A lot of, especially the larger companies, have online courses. They have posters, or they have banners, or they have memos, or they have things that go out to educate the users about, the new viruses, or what to do if there's an incident that takes place. Another thing that I see that doesn't take place in a lot of organizations is enforcement. Companies will go through a lot of effort, spend a lot of money with coming up with the technical solutions, the processes, the policies. They do all of that, but then they don't have procedures or a thought about, well, what happens when people don't follow our rules? Who's going to enforce? How does that enforcement take place? And most of us know that if there's rules and there's not ramifications for not following them, then they're not overly important. So enforcement is actually very important, that people know that something's actually going to happen. But a lot in the corporate world, they're not very good about enforcement. In the military, the government, they're much better about that.
So we covered a lot of information, and I have another question that I want you to go through. And again, the reason that I'm doing this is because a lot of the information that we've covered today is not complex. This test covers an inch deep and a mile wide, so it's not overly complex, but the questions are going to be tricky. So take a minute, go through this question, and figure out what you think the right answer is. Okay, so the right answer is B, using access controls. And if we look at the question, it says, a company needs to be concerned about an asset's reliability, confidentiality, and integrity. What is used to enforce protection of integrity? Now, control A, controlling physical security. Well, there could be digital things that affect the integrity. So physical security isn't enough. C talks about enforcing the rules of confidentiality, which is not integrity. D is talking about logical security, which is technical. The exam actually uses, and the industry use, logical and technical interchangeably. So D just talks about technical. And remember, we have administrative, physical, and technical controls. So that's why B is the right answer, using access controls, because it actually includes A, C, and D. And that's kind of how this exam goes, is a lot of times there's a question or there's an answer that covers the rest of the answers. And why some people think that, you know, they'll take the exam and they'll be there and they'll say, boy, there's 2 right answers, or there's 3 right answers, and they'll go over and over and over again. But one of the answers most likely encompasses the other 2 answers. So using access control covers physical security, it covers logical security, and, you know, C, we're not even talking about confidentiality.
So we've gone through the first domain that deals mainly with administrative type of controls. And there's a lot of information you need to know. Administrative controls, technical controls, physical controls. You need to know what they are and examples. We talked about confidentiality, integrity, availability. Not only do you need to know what those are, but the types of controls that need to be put in place to provide them. You need to really understand a lot about risk management. That's why this is the largest portion of this domain, because risk management is really important on the exam and in the industry. So in risk management, we talked about figuring out the value of assets, which is not just the purchasing of them. We talked about qualitative versus quantitative. We went through in quantitative, which is numbers-based. We looked at the formulas of how to calculate the SLE, which is asset value times exposure factor. We talked about how to calculate the ALE, which is SLE times ARO. ARO is the frequency. We went through cost-benefit analysis. We talked about total risk versus residual risk. Total risk is before you actually put a control in. Residual risk is afterwards. There's 4 ways of dealing with risk, which is mitigation, transferring, avoidance, and what else? We have mitigation, you transfer it, you avoid it, or you accept it. And you would accept the actual risk if the countermeasure actually costs more than your potential loss. We went through information classification, that you have to set up an actual program. The data owners do the classification of the data custodians actually set up the systems, do the configuration, they fulfill what the data owner says. The amount of classifications, you shouldn't have too many or too little. We talked about employee issues of when you hire somebody, you're not just hiring a skill set, you're hiring a person, and so you need to do the background check, look at it at possibly clearances, their education, their experience. Unfriendly termination, we talked about that we need to make sure that those accounts are disabled. So that's not all. That's not all that you need to know within this domain, but those are some of the key points that we covered that is definitely important for the CISSP exam and for your work in the industry.